It was, as Lord Peter Wimsey later remarked, an unseasonable morning for death, too fine by half. The fog had not yet crept in from the fens, the crocuses were displaying indecent optimism, and the church bells of Little Brimley rang with such cheery correctness that even the devout might have suspected artifice. Lord Peter, who was staying at the neighbouring hall under protest, "One cannot, Bunter, live indefinitely on the gratitude of vicars," had been persuaded by the rector's wife to attend morning service. He had accepted on the grounds that a man who fears no sermon cannot be wholly irreligious. The irony was not lost when, scarcely an hour later, the Reverend Hubert Claymore, rector of Little Brimley, popular preacher, occasional poet, and a man generally admired for his rather fine hands, was found dead in his vestry, having, as the churchwarden put it with grim understatement, taken a most improper turn. The scene, when Wimsey arrived, was indecently picturesque. The vestry door stood ajar, revealing a slanted shaft of spring light upon the rector's form, collapsed against the oak prie-dieu, his right hand still gripping a sheaf of sermon papers. His expression was one of petrified astonishment, as though he had glimpsed something profoundly unexpected immediately before his death. "Heart," murmured Inspector Treadgold, a practical man with a distrust of Latin and aristocrats alike. "That'll be it, my lord. Dropped mid-blessing, poor chap." Said Wimsey, adjusting his monocle with the vague air of a man examining a beetle he did not entirely approve of. "Heart, perhaps, but a little untimely, don't you think, and so very symmetrical. Look at the angle of his fall, Bunter. Doesn't it suggest rehearsal?" Bunter, appearing as if conjured by logic itself, bent over the body. "Indeed, my lord, the right sleeve is slightly scorched. One might almost imagine an electrical misfortune." "Yet one doesn't," said Wimsey cheerfully. "The rector was not in the habit of wiring his sermons for effect, I take it?" Inspector Treadgold scowled. "There's the electric heater by the wall. Old wiring might have gone off like a flash when he bent to switch it." "Possibly," said Wimsey, with that dangerous tone that implied probability had just been declared a liar. "Though in that case, dear Treadgold, I'm puzzled by the small matter of the candle. One doesn't generally use an electric heater and a lit candle simultaneously, unless one has an aesthetic death wish." Sure enough, upon the oak table near the corpse stood a single candle, burned down nearly to its socket. The wax had pooled and hardened in a curious double drip, one line trailing toward the sermon notes, another toward the vestry door, like the bifurcation of an argument. The inspector glanced at it without enthusiasm. "A candle's a candle. These parsons like their little touches." "Indeed," said Wimsey softly. "And sometimes they overdo them." He picked up the sermon manuscript delicately between two fingers. Its title, in bold ecclesiastical ink, read, "On the Vanity of Hidden Sin." "Now that," murmured Wimsey, "is an unfortunate choice for a man who dies mid-sermon. Bunter, do remind me, wasn't it the late Dean of Chichester who collapsed after preaching on death in the midst of life? There's a lesson in professional tact to be found there, if only posthumously." As the bell continued its pious tolling outside, Wimsey moved to the narrow window and looked out over the churchyard. The sunlight fell upon the leaning stones, the budding yews, and, incongruously, the black motor-car of Dr. Lethbridge, the village physician, now hurrying up the lane. "I wonder," he mused, "whether the Reverend Claymore died of his own sermon, or from fear of it. It would be a novel case, Bunter. Self-inflicted pulpit anxiety, fatal in the second verse of the epistle." Bunter made no reply, but his expression, discreetly bland, suggested that his master had already scented something unpleasant beneath the linen and incense. "Still," said Wimsey briskly, turning back, "let us not be premature. It may be mere accident, or even the wrath of heaven, though the Almighty, I fancy, seldom arranges his judgments with quite such domestic precision. Let's hear what the village has to say for itself, Treadgold. The English laity are never so lyrical as when they've just lost a clergyman." And with that, Lord Peter Wimsey stepped out into the spring morning, his cane tapping lightly against the stones, the faintest trace of amusement touching his mouth. The sermon, unfinished, fluttered behind him like a pale ghost in the draught. The village of Little Brimley received tragedy in the same way it received the weather, politely, with mild irritation and a determination to make something of it over tea. By the time Wimsey had crossed the churchyard to the rectory, the narrative had already begun to acquire local embroidery. Mrs. Vane, the housekeeper, was convinced the rector had been struck down in the midst of righteousness, though she admitted, when pressed, that Mr. Claymore had seemed a touch queer in himself these past days, sort of nervous about the pulpit, like he'd forgot his own prayers. The rectory itself was of the usual order, too large for comfort and too genteel for honesty. Wimsey was shown to the study, a room that bore the air of a man who preferred thinking to dusting. Books leaned conspiratorially in uneven rows. The air smelled faintly of paper, candle wax, and damp cassock. "Poor master," said Mrs. Vane, smoothing her apron with Protestant vigor. "Never the same since Christmas, sir. A kind man, only. He'd sit up half the night writing and muttering. Said he was revising sermons, but I heard him once say, 'It must be done before Sunday, or it's all for nothing.' That's not right talk for a clergyman, is it, my lord?" "It depends," said Wimsey, examining the fireplace. "Some of them believe salvation depends upon punctuation." He stooped to pick up a small fragment of charred paper lodged beneath the grate. It bore 3 words, half-burned yet legible. "The Second Confession." He slipped it into his pocket with an absent air. "Did the Reverend expect visitors yesterday?" "Only Mr. Harkness from the manor, sir. Came about the Easter fete accounts," he said. "Stayed a good while. They was arguing, respectfully, of course." "Ah, yes," murmured Wimsey. "Respectful argument. The most English form of bloodshed." He turned toward the desk, noticing a curious disorder. The inkpot had been overturned and righted, leaving a thin black ring upon the wood. A letter lay half-written in Claymore's hand, the pen strokes jagged, hurried. The addressee was Canon Frobisher, Ely Cathedral. The letter began, "My dear Canon, there is something upon my conscience which, if I delay longer, will ruin me utterly." The rest trailed off into a smear of ink and a line that looked suspiciously like a tremor rather than a signature. "Tell me," said Wimsey lightly, "did the Reverend often write to Canon Frobisher?" Mrs. Vane hesitated. "They trained together, sir. Good friends in their day, but there had been no letters for years, till lately." "Lately," repeated Wimsey. "How recently?" 3 weeks ago, sir. He posted one himself in the evening after the bell-ringers had gone. Said it was a private matter of doctrine." Wimsey smiled faintly. "Doctrine, Mrs. Vane, is a word that covers a multitude of sins. And tell me, who was last to see the rector alive this morning?" "That'd be Miss Lacey, the organist. She came to practice before service. Said she found him pale as anything, sitting by the vestry door with his sermon pages all about him and muttering, 'Oh, I shouldn't like to say it, sir.'" "Do," said Wimsey kindly. "She said he kept saying, 'It's coming again. It knows.'" Over and over. But Miss Lacey's young and apt to imagine things. She plays like an angel but jumps at her own echo. "Does she indeed?" said Wimsey, eyes brightening. "Then we must have a word with this angel directly." Outside, the bells had ceased, and the air was taking on that uneasy stillness peculiar to English villages after scandal. As Wimsey and Bunter crossed the lane to the church once more, the inspector came hurrying toward them, looking annoyed. "Doctor's done with the body," Treadgold reported. "Says the heart just stopped. Nothing more to it." "Nothing more," repeated Wimsey, amused. "Oh, my dear Treadgold, there's always something more. If hearts simply stopped of their own accord, the funeral trade would be much poorer. What did the good doctor base his conclusion on? Lack of marks or poison, apparently. Excellent. A death that leaves nothing behind but theology. Those are the best sort. They found Miss Lacy seated near the chancel, her thin fingers folded primly in her lap. She was 25, nervous, with an earnest face and an unfortunate tendency to blush, as if apologizing for her own existence. Her eyes, however, were observant, and Whimsy liked her immediately. "I should hate to intrude upon grief," he began, bowing slightly. "But perhaps you might indulge my curiosity. You saw Mr. Claymore this morning, I believe?" "Yes," she whispered. "He looked frightened. I thought at first he was unwell. He asked if the clock in the tower had been wound. I said yes, of course. It always is on Saturday night. Then he told me to check again. Twice. He said, 'If it strikes wrong, Miss Lacy, I shall know.'" "How very odd," murmured Whimsy. "And did it strike wrong?" "No, my lord. It struck perfectly at 8. But when I began playing the prelude, I thought I heard him crying out in the vestry. I stopped, and then it was quiet again. I assumed I'd imagined it." "Quite natural," said Whimsy gravely. "Music can be deceptive. It lets one hear things not meant for the ear." He paused, glancing toward the tower as if considering something far beyond bricks and bells. "Did he ever speak of fears, Miss Lacy? Of guilt, perhaps?" She hesitated, twisting her gloves. "Only once. After choir practice last week, he said, 'There are sermons that kill, Miss Lacy, and one must be certain it is not one's own soul that dies first.'" Whimsy regarded her thoughtfully, then looked toward the vestry door, now closed, and the silent clock above. "Bunter," he said softly, "I think we must have a look at that tower after all. If the Reverend Claymore feared his sermon, perhaps it wasn't the theology that frightened him, but the timing." And with that, Lord Peter set off toward the spiral stair, his footsteps echoing faintly against the ancient stone, while far below, the candle's last curl of smoke still lingered like an unanswered question. The tower staircase was narrow and uneven, spiraling upward with the reluctant dignity of something unused to visitors. Whimsy's cane tapped lightly as he ascended, the sound mingling with the dull hum of the bell rope swaying gently in the draught. Halfway up, he paused and touched the cold stone wall where faint soot marks marred the mortar near a small wooden shelf. A lantern had once stood there, recently used by the look of the residue. "Curious," he murmured. "Bunter, does one ordinarily light lanterns in daylight for purposes of spiritual elevation?" "Not commonly, my lord," replied Bunter, who was examining a small brass mechanism near the bell. "But this, perhaps, may justify it. Someone's been tinkering with the clock drive. The latch is unscrewed and the pendulum weight's been shifted. Barely half an inch, but enough to throw the striking out of sequence." "Ah," said Whimsy with quiet delight. "A matter of seconds, perhaps. A sermon begun too early or ended too late, and all heaven or hell let loose. A fatal error in horology, not theology. One must admire such precision." He leaned to peer through the slit window overlooking the vestry roof below. From this angle, he could see the narrow vent that opened directly into the chamber where Claymore had died. "Bunter, observe. If one desired to hear, or transmit, sound from the tower to the vestry, that vent would serve admirably. The acoustics of these Norman structures are treacherous. Whispers become thunderclaps. Indeed, my lord, though one wonders what precisely required so careful an arrangement." "Something timed," said Whimsy softly, "and meant to be heard. Perhaps a warning or a summons. Or," he added with grim humor, "a sermon's second voice." They descended, and by the time they re-entered the nave, Inspector Treadgold was waiting with a look of professional impatience. "You'll find nothing supernatural up there, my lord. We've checked every wire, every heater. Nothing amiss." "Oh, but something is amiss," said Whimsy pleasantly. "Only it has chosen a very English disguise. Punctuality." He strolled to the vestry again, where the physician, Dr. Lethbridge, was packing his instruments with the air of a man unwillingly implicated in melodrama. Whimsy greeted him with courteous boredom. "A most unpleasant morning for medicine, Doctor. Tell me, was the Reverend Claymore a healthy man?" "Remarkably so. Bit of neuralgia, perhaps, but his heart was sound last I examined him." "Still, these things happen." "Ah, yes, the English heart. So resilient in disappointment, so capricious in duty." "You saw nothing unusual about his posture or expression?" Lethbridge frowned. "Unusual? Perhaps." He looked startled, as though he'd heard something unexpected. The eyes were open, pupils dilated. "Startled," repeated Whimsy, "but not afraid. Hard to tell. Shock, maybe. Sudden fright can arrest the heart." "Or something designed to do precisely that," murmured Whimsy. The doctor gave him a weary glance. "You think he was murdered, then?" "With what? An invisible dagger?" Whimsy smiled. "No, merely with timing." Treadgold sighed audibly. "You'll be telling me next it's witchcraft. Half the village will agree with you." "I should hope not," said Whimsy, his eyes brightening with sudden animation. "Witchcraft would be too obvious. The English murderer, dear Inspector, prefers reason. He kills not by curse, but by contrivance, preferably something that can be mistaken for an act of God." As they stepped outside, Miss Lacey was waiting near the lich gate, pale but composed. "My lord," she said quietly, "you asked about the clock. I went back just now. It's half a minute slow again." "Is it indeed?" Whimsy regarded her with grave interest. "A very temperamental clock. Tell me, who winds it?" "Mr. Harkness, sir, the churchwarden. He's always done it." "Ah, the same Mr. Harkness who quarrelled with the rector yesterday, a man of practical temperament, no doubt." "He manages the parish accounts," she said uncertainly. "Some say the rector didn't trust him, but I think they misunderstood. He was kind, only strict." Whimsy nodded, half to himself. "Kindness and strictness, a lethal combination, Miss Lacey, when united in one breast, especially in matters of money or morality. They suggest a man who kills with good intentions." Miss Lacey shivered, and Whimsy's tone softened at once. "Forgive me. I speak only in the abstract. But tell me, was Mr. Harkness in church this morning?" "No, sir. He said he had a headache. But his car was seen by the gate just after 8. "Interesting," said Whimsy. "Because by Miss Lacey's own testimony, the clock struck 8 precisely when she began playing, and the rector was alive then. Barely. Yet the clock, which now runs half a minute slow, would have struck early this morning, not late, which suggests our friend the warden may have wound it, just enough to alter the sequence, without appearing to do so." Treadgold looked unimpressed. "You're making much of half a minute, my lord." "Half a minute," said Whimsy, gazing up at the tower with quiet reverence, "is the distance between innocence and guilt in every hanging ever carried out in this country. I fancy we should pay Mr. Harkness a call before luncheon." The inspector grumbled assent, and as they set off down the lane toward the manor, Whimsy paused briefly to glance back at the church. The silent bell loomed above, motionless now, but its ropes swayed faintly in the breeze as though something unseen still tugged from below, some echo that had not quite finished ringing through the stone. He touched his hat to it, almost genially. "Timing," he said under his breath, "is everything in sermon and in sin alike." Then he followed Bunter and the inspector down the lane, the mystery tightening quietly around them like a noose of seconds. The road to Harkness Manor wound between low hedgerows and bare elms, the sort of English countryside that looked as though it had been carefully ironed for posterity. Whimsy walked at a leisurely pace, his cane tracing idle hieroglyphs in the dust. The inspector, less patient, tramped beside him with the energy of a man determined to find nothing suspicious. "Mr. Harkness," said Whimsy conversationally, "is of the landed gentry variety or the commercial convert?" "Old farming family," Treadgold replied. bit of money from beat and better sense than most. Runs the parish like a ledger. Keeps the church solvent, the curate humble, and the fate profitable. An admirable trinity, murmured Whimsy. And he quarrels with the rector, naturally, about the fourth element, morality. Bunter, who was walking a discreet few paces behind, observed, "There is always a touch of the fiscal in rural righteousness, my lord." "Indeed," said Whimsy, his eyes narrowing as the grey outline of the manor came into view, a square Georgian house set back from the road, its windows neat and humourless. Observe, Treadgold, the architecture of virtue, symmetrical, expensive, and completely without warmth. They were shown into a study that reflected its owner, impeccably ordered and singularly unlovely. Mr. Harkness rose from behind a desk covered with account books and nodded curtly. He was a broad man of 50, with a high colour and that particular stiffness that betrays a lifelong habit of suppressing impatience. "I suppose you're here about poor Claymore," he said before anyone could speak. "Tragic business, though frankly I saw it coming. The man was overwrought, quite unsound lately." "In what way?" asked Whimsy, taking the offered chair as though it were an experiment in furniture design. "Obsessed with sin, couldn't let it alone. Talked of confession as if we were Roman Catholics. He even accused me of dishonesty in the parish accounts, if you please. Me, who's managed those funds for 20 years. The man had lost his sense of proportion. "Did you have this discussion yesterday?" Harkness's eyes flickered, just for a second. "We exchanged words. Nothing of consequence. I told him to rest, to leave the money matters until after Easter." "Very considerate," murmured Whimsy. "And then, of course, you stayed home this morning with a headache." The man's head jerked up. "Who told you that?" "Miss Lacey mentioned it, quite innocently, though your car was seen by the church gate just after 8. Harkness's flush deepened. "I drove by, yes, to check the bell rope. It's been fraying, and Claymore insisted it was safe. I meant to prove him wrong, but the church door was locked, so I went home again." "Quite so," said Whimsy. "A charitable impulse to inspect the bell while your rector rehearsed his sermon. Did you by any chance adjust the clock mechanism while you were there?" "The clock?" Harkness looked genuinely puzzled. "Or practiced?" "Certainly not. Why should I?" "Why indeed?" said Whimsy gently. "A matter of seconds is hardly worth one's conscience, unless those seconds are all that separate salvation from exposure." Treadgold gave him a warning look, but Whimsy's gaze remained amiable. "Tell me, Mr. Harkness, did you know Canon Frobisher of Ely?" "Only by name. Claymore mentioned him once or twice. Some mentor from college days." "Why?" "No reason at all. Merely tracing correspondence. A harmless hobby." Whimsy rose and adjusted his gloves. "You'll forgive the intrusion. Deaths in vestries unsettle even the godless." As they left the house, Treadgold muttered darkly, "You're needling him on purpose. If he's innocent, you'll have him packing for the continent." "If he's innocent," said Whimsy lightly, "he'll merely send for his solicitor. It's only the guilty who check the clock before answering a question." They had reached the gate when Bunter, who had lingered in the hall under pretext of retrieving a handkerchief, emerged with quiet efficiency. "A small observation, my lord. There's a faint smell of paraffin near the study hearth, most likely from a lantern recently cleaned, and in the umbrella stand, a length of coarse twine with soot upon it." Whimsy's brows lifted. Lanterns and ropes. 2 useful accessories for a man visiting a tower. Our Mr. Harkness is tidy enough to clean a lamp he did not use, and careless enough to forget the scent. That, Bunter, is the poetry of guilt. "Do you truly believe he killed the rector?" asked Treadgold, exasperated. "I believe," said Whimsy, "that someone arranged a performance in that church, a sermon with 2 voices. One human, one mechanical. The Reverend, already terrified by something he could not name, hears his own words thrown back to him from the tower. His own sermon repeated or twisted, like an echo from hell, and his heart, most obligingly, obeys the cue. Then you're saying, I'm saying nothing, my dear fellow. Not yet. The difference between inspiration and incrimination is timing, and I haven't quite heard the downbeat. They returned toward the rectory as the afternoon light began to fade, the air turning chill. The church tower rose again against the sky, serene, oblivious, its great clock face reflecting the pale sun like an unblinking eye. Whimsy stopped at the lich gate, studying it thoughtfully. "Bunter," he said, "we shall require Canon Frobisher's reply, if any, to that unfinished letter, and we must find out what became of Claymore's sermon drafts from last week. There's one missing, the second confession. I believe it was called. If words can kill, I'd like to know precisely how he phrased the murder." And with that, Lord Peter strode back toward the silent church, his expression one of almost scholarly curiosity, as if the entire village were an experiment in logic that had momentarily misfired. The wind rose behind him, carrying the faint toll of the hour. 8 strokes, though the sun had not yet set. Whimsy paused, counting them softly under his breath. "Half a minute fast," he murmured, smiling faintly. How very conscientious of it. By evening, the rectory had settled into that peculiar stillness that follows a death. Neither grief nor calm, but a kind of respectful hesitation, as though the very walls were waiting to hear what would be decided about them. Whimsy had commandeered the rector's study, spreading Claymore's papers across the desk with the care of a man handling relics rather than evidence. Bunter stood by the lamp, sorting sermon pages with a librarian's precision. "Observe, Bunter," Whimsy murmured, leaning forward. "Our late divine had an unfortunate passion for alliteration. Sins seen and unseen, the price of pride, the second confession." A tidy mind, though a touch theatrical. "You recall the fragment we found in the grate? This must have been its companion piece." He drew out a thin sheaf of pages, their top edge singed. The title was indeed The Second Confession. The text began innocently enough, moral reflections on duplicity and self-deceit, but halfway down the second page the tone shifted abruptly. The writing grew hurried, personal. "I have lived too long under false peace. It must be said, whatever it costs. If I do not confess, the other will, and he will not confess in mercy." "Now that," said Whimsy softly, "isn't a sermon at all. It's a negotiation with fear." He turned the page, but the next leaf was blank, as though the author's courage had faltered mid-thought. "The other, Bunter, there's our missing voice. One spoke from the pulpit, the other from the tower." At that moment, a knock came. Inspector Treadgold entered, clutching a folded telegram. "Message for you, my lord. From Ely Cathedral. Canon Frobisher." Whimsy opened it, his expression sharpening. Received Claymore's letter. He wrote of atonement demanded by one who knows. Requested meeting next week, a deeply troubled tone. Regret I could not reach him in time. He read it twice, then looked up. So, the Reverend expected revelation. His past, it seems, had grown impatient. I wonder which sin finally found its voice. Treadgold shrugged. "If you ask me, it's just hysteria. The man cracked. All this talk of clocks and echoes." "Hysteria," interrupted Whimsy, "requires imagination. Clergymen rarely possess enough of it to die artistically. No, he was driven. Methodically, I think. Someone wanted him terrified. Terrified enough that when the church bell spoke in his own voice, he believed judgment had come." Treadgold frowned. "You're saying Harkness somehow made the bell talk?" "Not the bell, perhaps. The vent between tower and vestry. A gramophone placed high above, hidden by stonework, set to play a recorded voice at the precise moment the clock struck. The Reverend, already shaking from fear, hears himself, his own sermon, coming back from the heavens. A neat trick of acoustics, and the heart obliges." Bunter inclined his head slightly. It would explain the altered pendulum weight, my lord. The recording must have been timed to coincide exactly with the chime. Quite so. But what we lack, said Whimsy, tapping the desk, is the motive for so elaborate a cruelty. What did Claymore know that was worth the trouble of frightening him to death? He stood, pacing the length of the room. He accused Harkness of dishonesty, perhaps with reason. Suppose the Fete funds were misused, the accounts falsified. Claymore threatens exposure, and our good church warden, skilled in mechanisms and moral arithmetic alike, devises a retribution worthy of Milton. He'll make the rector confess, if not in life, then by panic. Treadgold hesitated. But if you're right, where's the gramophone now? We searched the tower. Not thoroughly enough, said Whimsy, reaching for his coat. It will not be left in plain sight. Harkness is far too proper a man for that. He will have hidden his devil in a place sanctified by cleanliness. Come, Bunter, let us revisit the tower by candlelight. Evil often looks better after vespers. They went out into the dusk, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and yew. The church loomed ahead, its stained glass windows glimmering faintly. Inside, their steps echoed across the flagstones. Whimsy moved with deliberate quiet, his lamp beam sliding across the pews and up the spiral stair. Halfway to the belfry, he paused again, studying the wall where Bunter had earlier noted the soot. Bring the light closer. Beneath the shelf, nearly hidden in the shadow of a beam, was a small recess covered by a plank roughly nailed into place. Whimsy pried it loose with the tip of his cane. Inside, wrapped in black cloth, lay a portable gramophone and a single record sleeve marked, "On the Vanity of Hidden Sin, Recording I." "Dear heaven," whispered Treadgold, peering over his shoulder. "He recorded the sermon." "Not he," corrected Whimsy with grim satisfaction. "It was done to him." He wound the gramophone, placed the needle, and stood back. From the tinny horn issued the unmistakable voice of the late Reverend Claymore, solemn, clear, and disturbingly calm. "And there shall come a day when every secret is made known." The echo filled the narrow chamber, curling down the stair like the whisper of judgment itself. Whimsy stopped the record, his expression unreadable. Imagine hearing that alone in the vestry, already half crazed with guilt. Even a theologian's heart might stop, if prompted by the hand that wound the clock. Treadgold swore softly. "We'll have him for it. I'll get a warrant." "Do," said Whimsy absently, still gazing at the machine. "But take care, Inspector. We have yet to ask what sin the Reverend feared being made known, and whether Harkness truly was the only one who knew it. The echo we've found may not be the first." As they descended, the church seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the next toll. Outside, the night was very still. Whimsy glanced once more at the dark tower, and murmured, almost to himself, "The voice was borrowed, but the guilt, I think, was shared." They left the church in silence, the cold air pressing close around them. Whimsy walked a few paces ahead, hands clasped behind his back, his step light but his gaze distant, as if he were watching thoughts form and dissolve on the horizon. The village lay dim and drowsy, smoke rising from chimneys in uncertain spirals. Only the faint toll of the clock, now a minute slow again, seemed awake and listening. "Bunter," he said at last, "we must not allow ourselves to be too easily satisfied. Harkness may have engineered the mechanism, but I mistrust neat conclusions. There is always one more layer in the English conscience." Bunter nodded gravely. "You believe another hand was involved, my lord?" "I believe another heart was," Whimsy replied. Claymore's terror was not merely of discovery, but of the discoverer. His letter to Frobisher implies blackmail, of a moral rather than financial kind. One does not write of atonement demanded by one who knows, without implication of prior guilt. Treadgold, trudging behind, muttered, "He accused Harkness of dishonesty. Maybe the Reverend discovered his accounts were short." Whimsy smiled faintly. You mistake the temperature of the sin, Inspector. Money chills. This burns. The man who dies of fear does not do so over £6.08. They reached the rectory gate as the lamps were being lit. Mrs. Vane appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands. "Oh, my lord, I'm that thankful you've come back. There's been someone here asking after you. Said he'd news from Ailey. Wouldn't give his name, only said it concerned the rector's other letter." Whimsy's eyes brightened. "Did he leave anything?" "A note, sir." She produced an envelope, creased and faintly damp. Whimsy opened it and read aloud. The confession was never meant for Frobisher. "Tell them the truth sleeps behind the glass. M.L." "Miss Lacey," murmured Whimsy. "Our trembling angel of the organ loft grows mysterious. Behind the glass. What an ecclesiastically ambiguous phrase. It might refer to a window or a mirror." He strode past Mrs. Vane into the rector's study. The lamplight gleamed faintly on the framed certificates above the desk and on a small cabinet of devotional items. Silver cross, prayer book, and an old framed photograph. Whimsy took up the frame and examined it with narrowed eyes. "Glass," he murmured, "and something beneath it." The photograph, an old group of theological students, had been pasted over another sheet. With a delicate motion of his penknife, he lifted one corner. Beneath it lay a folded page, yellowed and covered in the same neat, angular hand as Claymore's sermons. He unfolded it carefully. The first line read, "For the eyes of God are not deceived by the robes of men." Further down, a few words leapt out. "Margaret Lacey, the summer of my ordination. The vow broken, repentance demanded." "Dear me," said Whimsy quietly. So that was the second confession. He turned the page over, finding more. His tone grew colder, detached. "The Reverend appears to have written this as a private record, perhaps never intended for the church. He believed he had sinned with Miss Lacey, then taken vows under false purity. It seems she was sent away, perhaps paid off, and returned later to the village, installed safely at the organ." Treadgold gave a low whistle. "And she's been tormenting him ever since." "Not tormenting," corrected Whimsy, his voice thoughtful. "Reminding. The voice of conscience sometimes prefers to sing in the soprano." He laid the paper flat. "But fear can be contagious. If Miss Lacey wished him to confess, she might have enlisted Harkness, the practical man, to provide the means. A harmless fright, meant to drive the rector to repentance. Instead, the fright became fatal." Bunter inclined his head. "Then both are complicit, my lord. One morally, one mechanically." "Precisely. A duet in two keys. Guilt and righteousness." Whimsy moved to the window, looking out toward the church, where the faint gleam of moonlight rested upon the tower. She wrote, "Behind the glass." Perhaps she meant for us to find this. Guilt loves company, and Miss Lacey is tired of singing solo. He turned abruptly. "Inspector, we shall visit her now, but gently. Terror has been the only language spoken in this village for some time, and I should hate to add a new verse." The organist's cottage stood a short walk away, half buried under ivy, the windows faintly lit. Miss Lacey opened the door before Whimsy could knock, as if she had been expecting him. Her eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness. "You found it," she said simply. Whimsy inclined his head. "Behind the glass, yes. You were quite right to hide it there. But tell me, Miss Lacey, was it you who asked Mr. Harkness to frighten the rector?" She hesitated, then nodded, tears beginning to tremble in her eyes. "He wouldn't listen, my lord. He said confession was weakness, that his secret had been forgiven long ago. I thought, if he heard his own words, condemning himself, he'd repent. Mr. Harkness built the contraption. He said it would only scare him a little. I didn't mean—" Her voice broke. Whimsy's tone remained very quiet. "Fear is the most dangerous sermon of all, Miss Lacey. Once preached, it cannot be recalled." She pressed her hands to her face. He thought it was a miracle. He thought God himself was answering. "Yes," said Whimsy gently, "and the irony is that he was, through two very human instruments. That's often his way." He stepped back, the shadows softening around him. "I will say this for you, Miss Lacey. You did not kill him. You only lit the candle by which he saw the truth too suddenly." Outside, the clock struck 9. Soft, uncertain, half a minute behind its time again. Whimsy listened to the echoes fade, his expression unreadable. "Tomorrow," he said quietly to Bunter as they turned away. "We shall speak with Mr. Harkness again. The timepiece has corrected itself, but I fancy his conscience has not." Morning came sullen and colourless, with a frost that clung to the graves like a veil too heavy to lift. The church bells, now properly in order, gave their first chime of the day with a tone so exact that Whimsy, standing by the gate in his overcoat and hat tipped rakishly against the wind, remarked it was the first honest statement of time uttered in this village for a week. Bunter, precise as always, adjusted the notebook beneath his arm. "Shall I fetch Mr. Harkness, my lord?" "No need," said Whimsy, eyes half closed as he watched the smith's forge across the green begin to smoke. "He is already on his way. There's a kind of moral magnetism about guilt. One need only stand in the proper spot, and it will be drawn to you like iron filings." True to the prediction, Harkness appeared some minutes later, his coat collar up and his boots still white with frost. His expression was resolute but hollow. A man who had rehearsed honesty but found the words too heavy for his mouth. "My lord," he began, removing his cap, "I heard you was asking after me again. I've told you all I know." Whimsy smiled thinly. "I imagine you've told me all you dared to know, Mr. Harkness. But I have a small curiosity regarding your craft. You repaired the vestry clock, did you not?" "Aye. The rector was fussy about his time. And the mechanism you installed to broadcast his voice, did you employ the same wiring?" Harkness hesitated, eyes flickering. "Maybe. It saved a bit of trouble." "Indeed. It also explains why the clock faltered each time the voice was heard. Rather poetic, that, the heart of the church stopping whenever its master's guilt spoke out." The blacksmith's hands tightened around his cap. "I never meant to hurt him. Miss Lacey said it were just to give him a start, to bring him to himself again." "Quite. And yet you went further. You devised a system to deliver his own recorded words through the walls of his church. A clever thing for a village craftsman, almost too clever. I suspect, Mr. Harkness, that this was not your first experiment in such matters." A flicker of pride crossed the man's face before shame followed it. "I've worked with electricals before, down in Norwich. Used to fix phonographs for a gentleman there. He showed me how a man's voice could live after him if you turned a crank. Reckon that stuck with me." Whimsy studied him with faint amusement. "The resurrection of sound, how theological of you. But tell me, did you test it the night before the rector's death?" "I did, my lord." "Just after dusk. The clock gave a bit of trouble, so I was there late. But the rector weren't in. Miss Lacey said he was at prayers. Then the recording must already have been placed." Harkness blinked. "Recording? I only wired the bell to catch echoes like she asked." No voice was meant to come through. For a moment, the air seemed to still. Whimsy tilted his head, his voice now deceptively mild. "Ah, so it was not you who recorded Claymore's sermon." The man shook his head slowly, confusion spreading. "I couldn't. There weren't no equipment for that. I swear it." Whimsy turned away, walking a few steps toward the church. "Curious. Then someone else made the ghost speak, a third hand working between yours and Miss Lacey's. Someone who wished the rector not merely frightened, but destroyed." Inspector Treadgold, who had joined them quietly, muttered, "You think there's another party in it then?" "Oh, I never think. It muddles the evidence. But the pattern suggests as much. Miss Lacey wrote to stir conscience. Harkness provided the means, and yet the execution, the precision timing, the placement of the sound, the fatal delay, belongs to a mind more deliberate. He paused, glancing back toward the rectory. A mind, perhaps, that wished to silence both confession and confessor. Inside the church, Whimsy moved to the vestry where Claymore had died. The shadows still lingered like residue from a bad dream. He bent to inspect the wiring that traced the wall, fine copper running up behind the wood panels and into a small concealed switch box. He opened it with a penknife. Inside lay a tangle of connections, and, buried beneath, a wax cylinder. "Bunter," he murmured, "fetch your gloves." He lifted the cylinder delicately, holding it to the light. A recording, I believe. If Harkness is truthful, this did not come from him, which means someone had access both to the church and to Claymore's study. Someone who knew his habits and could transcribe his sermon without his noticing. "Miss Lacey, perhaps," Treadgold suggested. "Possibly. But recall the letter addressed to Frobisher, the one not yet posted. It warned of another who knows. If I'm not mistaken, we are about to meet that other." He took the cylinder under his arm and strode toward the rectory once more, the others following. The air had sharpened. Crows circled above the churchyard like scraps of moving ink. In the study, Whimsy placed the cylinder into the rector's old phonograph and wound the handle. A faint hiss filled the room, then the echo of Claymore's voice emerged, measured, heavy, unmistakable. "The wages of sin are not death, but remembrance." Bunter drew in a sharp breath, but Whimsy's gaze was fixed on the wall, where a faint crack ran from the clock to the bookshelf. "The phrasing," he said softly. "That line was never spoken in any of Claymore's printed sermons. Someone edited his words, shaped them into accusation. This was not confession. It was entrapment." He turned the cylinder over in his hand again, eyes narrowing. And here, beneath the wax, a faint engraving, F. Not Lacey, not Harkness. Frobisher. Inspector Treadgold frowned. But he was the one Claymore wrote to. Why would he? "Because," said Whimsy quietly, "he never intended to receive the letter. He intended it to die with its writer." The clock struck 10, its tone steady, unhurried, perfect. Whimsy smiled without warmth. "How neat the timing of guilt can be, Bunter. Every man's sin seems to strike the hour when most convenient to himself." He turned sharply toward the door. "Come, we are going to Ely. It's time we asked the good archdeacon why his friend the rector feared his own sermon." The road to Ely unspooled across the fens like a ribbon of damp slate, the fog rising in drifts that made the landscape seem a single grey breath. Whimsy sat back in the motor car, gloved hands resting lightly on his cane, eyes half closed as if listening to the rhythm of the engine rather than watching the scenery. Bunter drove with his usual unobtrusive precision, while Inspector Treadgold, beside him, shifted restlessly, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror, as though expecting the car itself to confess. After some time, Whimsy spoke, his tone musing rather than directed. "Archdeacon Frobisher, a man of position, piety, and, if his handwriting is any indication, excessive confidence in the finality of his own moral judgments. The letter from Claymore was never sent, yet found its way into his keeping. The cylinder bears his initial. Either coincidence is a tempting parody, or the archdeacon has mistaken the pulpit for a stage." Treadgold cleared his throat. "You think he killed the rector?" Whimsy smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, you phrase it as though murder were a hobby. No, I think the archdeacon contrived a little spiritual theatre which concluded, unfortunately, with a corpse where an audience should have been. He intended to frighten Claymore into confession, public, not private. The very idea would appeal to a cleric whose notion of salvation is best achieved under adequate supervision." The rest of the drive passed in a silence punctuated only by the squelch of tires through puddles and the occasional distant cry of a bird over the marsh. When at last Ely's cathedral loomed from the mist, it appeared more fortress than church, its stone towers pushing into the clouds like watchful sentinels. The archdeacon received them in a study that seemed more an archive than a room, papers and books stacked in teetering towers about the walls. His hair was white, his collar starched to the point of penance, and his eyes, small, sharp, and cold as wet pebbles, regarded whimsy with the unblinking scrutiny of a man who believes questions are a moral failing. "Lord Peter Wimsey," he said with a thin smile. I had not expected the great amateur of murder to call upon me. Wimsey bowed lightly. "Merely a pilgrim, Archdeacon, in search of enlightenment. I fear I've wandered into your diocese by way of sin rather than scripture." The Archdeacon did not smile. "You've been at Little Breedy, then. Unfortunate business. Poor Claymore, too much zeal, too little humility. But zeal without humility is always fatal, don't you think?" "Indeed," murmured Wimsey, examining a crucifix on the desk. "One might say the same of any craftsman who wishes his handiwork to resemble Providence." Frobisher's eyes narrowed. "If you've come to imply I had a hand in that tragic incident, you will find the accusation both blasphemous and unfounded." "Accusation, my dear Archdeacon?" Wimsey's tone was all airy innocence. "I had not accused. But since you mention it, I do find myself curious. How, precisely, did the rector's private sermons find their way to your archive?" Frobisher hesitated. A flicker of irritation instantly smoothed over. "Claymore often sent drafts to me for correction. His theology was impetuous." "Ah. Yet the particular sermon that terrified him, the voice of the living dead, was not among those you received." "I never saw it." "Indeed. Curious, then, that his recorded words never printed, should appear on a phonograph cylinder bearing your initial. Surely an oversight." The Archdeacon's gaze hardened. "I have no knowledge of such a thing. This gadgetry was never part of my concern. I advised him to abandon these modern indulgences. He was a man too susceptible to temptation, intellectual, spiritual, and otherwise." Wimsey leaned back, watching the man over steepled fingers. "And Miss Lacey, was she also one of your parishioners in need of correction?" The faintest ripple of discomfort crossed the older man's face. "A misguided girl. She fancied herself the conscience of her betters." "Then you knew of her connection to Claymore?" Frobisher exhaled sharply. "It was my duty to know. She came to me years ago when Claymore was first ordained, speaking of impropriety. I told her to keep silence, for his sake and hers. But she would not. I warned her that unrepentant sin breeds only destruction. It appears I was right." "Quite," said Wimsey softly. "Though I wonder, Archdeacon, whether your warning extended to a more practical form. Say, the construction of a moral tableau. A voice from the heavens, perhaps, calling the sinner to account." The Archdeacon's composure faltered. He rose abruptly, pacing to the window. "Sirs, you speak in riddles, Lord Peter. I have nothing to do with this ghastly business." Wimsey followed him with his gaze, unhurried. "And yet your influence drifts over it like incense. Miss Lacey's fear, Harkness's mechanism, Claymore's despair, all guided by an invisible hand, too accustomed to sermonizing from the shadows. Tell me, did you visit the rectory last week?" "No." "Strange. The rector's housekeeper recalls a caller, tall, severe, wearing clerical black and leaving by the side path, the same day the clock was tampered with." Frobisher's hand tightened on the window frame. "You have no proof?" "No," said Wimsey evenly. "But proof is a luxury truth seldom affords in moral affairs. Still, I suspect the phonograph will speak for itself once my man has it properly examined. Wax, you see, retains not only the voice but the conditions of its recording. A laboratory can tell whether it was made in the rectory or elsewhere." The Archdeacon turned, face pale but eyes bright with defiance. Even if I sought to make him confess, what of it? Would you condemn a priest for seeking salvation for another's soul? Whimsy regarded him with grave amusement. Not at all, Archdeacon. Only for seeking it in the wrong key. You orchestrated a ghost and found yourself with a corpse instead. The rector died believing God had judged him, when in fact it was merely you. A heavy silence fell. The cathedral bells began to toll the hour, their sound vast and inexorable. Frobisher's voice, when it came, was low and strangely tired. I wished only to save him. Yes, said Whimsy softly, and as usual, salvation proved lethal. Outside, the fog began to thin, the sun breaking through in pale streaks. Whimsy took his hat from the chair, bowing faintly. I shall have the phonograph tested, of course. Whether the law sees guilt in it is another matter, but perhaps, Archdeacon, the greater judgment has already occurred. As he left the room, Treadgold glanced back. Frobisher remained standing by the window, one hand on the glass, his reflection superimposed upon the cathedral beyond. A man already imprisoned by his own image. In the car, Bunter waited silently until they had driven a mile beyond Ely before speaking. A sad business, my lord. Yes, said Whimsy absently, watching the road unspool again. One of those moral tragedies that happen when a man confuses God's echo for his voice. The fog closed once more about them, soft and unending, as though the fens themselves were listening for what came next. They returned to Little Breedy as dusk drew its cold curtain across the fields. The village seemed to have folded itself inward. Smoke curling close to rooftops, curtains drawn early, lamps already burning with a faint, golden melancholy of guilt. Whimsy descended from the car with a faint sigh, brushing a fleck of frost from his sleeve as though it were an inconvenience of theology. Bunter, he said, there's a particular moment after one has looked upon the soul of a clergyman when even hell seems better ventilated. Fetch me a cigarette, will you? I require a measure of human vice to restore equilibrium. Bunter obliged wordlessly, striking the match with quiet reverence, and the thin glow of flame threw a pale reflection on Whimsy's face, an expression halfway between amusement and fatigue. Inspector Treadgold trudged beside them toward the rectory. You think Frobisher will confess, my lord? Whimsy exhaled a ribbon of smoke, eyes narrowing. Confession, Inspector, is a practice better suited to the guilty than the righteous. I doubt he will confess. He will justify. There's a certain theological distinction between the two, and Frobisher is precisely the sort of man to prefer damnation on principle. The housekeeper met them in the doorway, pale and trembling. Oh, my lord, thank heaven you've come. There's someone inside, up in the rector's study. I thought it was you returned, but the light's burning and... Oh, sir, I heard the clock chime again, though no one's touched it. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. How industrious of the dead. Come, Bunter, we'll pay the late rector another call. The three ascended the narrow stair. The air grew stiller, weighted with that faint, metallic chill of a room long used for prayer and thought. The study door stood ajar, a sliver of lamplight across the floorboards. Whimsy pushed it open quietly. Inside, Miss Lacey stood by the desk, her face ghost pale, one hand gripping the phonograph, the other pressed to her breast as if to hold her heart in place. On the desk lay the wax cylinder, the same one Whimsy had taken to Ely. My lord, she whispered, voice hoarse. I didn't steal it, I swear it. He sent it back. Frobisher did. There was a note. She held out a crumpled paper. Whimsy took it gently. You have destroyed enough souls. I return what is yours. May your conscience find a quieter sermon. Whimsy read it twice, lips tightening slightly. So the Archdeacon absolves himself by delegation. How consistent. Miss Lacey trembled. He told me I was to blame, that I led the rector astray, both before and after his vows. He said the voice was mine as much as his, but I only wanted the truth. Her eyes darted to the phonograph. He said this would clear him. He said it proves I made the recording, that my voice is mixed in. But it isn't true, my lord. It isn't. Whimsy bent over the machine, adjusting the crank delicately. The wax was cracked at the edges now, faintly warped, but the engraving, the faint F, remained. If the archdeacon returned it, he must have examined it, he murmured. And if he examined it, he knew it contained something fatal to himself. He turned to Bunter. You observed, of course, the faint second track on the cylinder when we found it. 2 recordings intertwined, one of Claymore, one faintly overlaid. Let us test a hypothesis. He wound the handle and the voice began again. Claymore's sonorous tone, thick with terror and righteousness. The wages of sin are not death, but remembrance. But now, beneath it, almost inaudible, another voice trembled, a whisper, desperate, female. Stop, please don't, Miss Lacy gasped, hands flying to her mouth. It's me, but that's from years ago. I never, how? Whimsy shut off the machine. The silence that followed was almost a living thing. Because, he said softly, the archdeacon recorded it without your knowledge. You went to him years ago, confessing your folly with Claymore. He must have captured your words, kept them. When Claymore later refused public confession, Frobisher merged your frightened plea with the rector's sermon, so that his voice seemed answered by yours, a divine duet of guilt and fear. Treadgold swore under his breath. He used her old confession to drive the man mad. Quite, said Whimsy, eyes fixed on the dim lamplight flickering in the phonograph horn. And when the rector heard it, he believed he was condemned by heaven, when in truth it was only the archdeacon's hand turning the crank. Miss Lacy sank to her knees, trembling. I told him, Frobisher, that it would kill him if he kept pushing. He said it was God's will. Oh, my lord, what will become of me? Whimsy knelt beside her, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. You will live, Miss Lacy. The dead are beyond scandal, and the living must learn to bear their humanity. He paused, glancing at the faint outline of the crucifix above the desk. The archdeacon's sin is pride dressed as virtue. Yours was love dressed as repentance, both fatal, but not equally damnable. He rose, gesturing to Treadgold. Inspector, you may inform Ely that I shall not trouble the archdeacon further. The church must settle this one herself. There are crimes that do not fit into law books, only into the conscience of the living. As they left the room, the rectory clock struck 11, its tone clearer now than it had been all week. Whimsy paused at the door, listening. Ah, he said quietly, the hour at last keeps its own counsel. Outside, the frost had hardened into glitter on the church roof. Miss Lacy's shadow fell long behind her as she followed them to the gate, her figure small beneath the vast indifference of the winter sky. Whimsy turned once more toward the dark tower of the church and murmured almost to himself, Strange, Bunter, how men cry for God's voice and never recognize their own echo. And with that, he lit another cigarette, the flame brief and trembling in the cold air, before vanishing down the road toward the station, leaving behind a silent church, a broken machine, and the faint, impossible whisper of a sermon that had finally ceased to preach. The train hummed through the Dorset countryside, the rhythmic pulse of the wheels merging with the faint hiss of wind against the glass. Whimsy sat motionless, hat tipped low, eyes fixed on the reflection that ghosted across the window, his own faint outline superimposed on a passing field of frost and shadow. Bunter sat opposite, notebook open on his knee, the quiet rustle of paper almost conspiratorial in the dim carriage light. I suppose that's the end of it, my lord? He asked softly, though his tone held the faintest question, as if he already knew Whimsy's answer. End, Whimsy murmured, without turning his gaze. My dear Bunter, one may end a sermon, but not the echoes it leaves behind. Frobisher will find no comfort in his pulpit tomorrow, and Miss Lacy's repentance will not silence the voice she heard. These things don't end, They fade, like the last vibration of a bell no one meant to strike. He tapped ash neatly into the tray, eyes narrowing slightly. Still, there's something that refuses to ring true. The note, for instance. Frobisher's phrasing, too deliberate, and the timing of its delivery. Bunter looked up. The postmark was this morning, sir. Precisely. Which means he returned the cylinder before I confronted him in Ely. Curious foreknowledge, wouldn't you say? A man preparing to absolve himself of evidence he should not yet have known I possessed. Bunter frowned. Then he was expecting you, my lord. Whimsy's lips curved faintly. Oh, I rather think he was expecting judgment, Bunter. He just hadn't decided from whose hand it would come. The train slowed as they reached Dorchester. Whimsy rose, brushing a trace of soot from his sleeve. Come along. There's one more courtesy call we must make before I put this case to bed, and I'm afraid it's to be a rather unpleasant one. The Archdeacon's residence was a quiet Georgian structure at the edge of the cathedral close, its windows dark but for a faint orange glow from the study. Whimsy knocked once. No answer. He tried the handle. It yielded easily. The latch had not been drawn. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of candle grease and old paper. The study door stood half open, just as it had at the rectory, and for a fleeting instant Whimsy felt an odd sense of repetition, as though the crime itself were looping back to observe its own reflection. He stepped inside. The Archdeacon sat slumped at his desk, a small brass crucifix fallen from his hand. His head rested on a stack of papers, and one candle had burned itself nearly to the socket, leaving a ring of wax around the base like a slow, deliberate clock. Bunter moved forward silently, then stopped. He's gone, my lord. Whimsy nodded, gaze tracing the room's arrangement. On the desk, beside the open Bible, lay a small phonograph cylinder, unmarked, save for the faint scratch of an etched cross. Beside it, a note written in a hand steadier than Frobisher's trembling theology might suggest. Not death, but remembrance. The voice is mine now. Whimsy stared at the words a long while before speaking. He couldn't bear silence after all, the sermon continued, only this time he meant it to end with him. Bunter hesitated. A suicide, then? Whimsy tilted his head. Possibly. Though one might argue he was simply finishing the sermon he began with Claymore's death. Pride seldom kills itself. It simply follows its own logic to the grave. He reached for the phonograph, lifting the cylinder delicately between thumb and forefinger. And yet he left this. A confession, perhaps, or another trick of the tongue. Without waiting for Treadgold or the coroner, he set the cylinder into place and wound the handle. The horn crackled. For a moment there was only static, the faint hum of breath. Then Frobisher's voice, solemn, resigned. Lord, if thou be just, forgive me not. For I have made of thy name a weapon, and of confession a snare. I sought righteousness, and found only power. The rector's death was mine, though my hands were clean. Let those who hear know this, the voice was never God's. It was mine, speaking as him. The final words broke into distortion, a thin whine of the needle slipping off track, then silence. Whimsy leaned back, extinguishing the candle with a soft breath. So ends the Archdeacon. He wanted to control the last word, even in death. Typical ecclesiastical vanity. He gives us the truth only when there's no one left to contradict it. Bunter closed his notebook, quietly respectful. And what of Miss Lacey, my lord? Whimsy paused at the door, looking back once at the still figure at the desk. Tell her the voice has stopped, Bunter. She deserves that much peace. As for the rest, let the church write its own epitaph. They stepped out into the cathedral close. The great tower loomed dark against the stars, bells motionless, the air perfectly still. Whimsy drew his coat closer, his breath misting faintly in the night. Curious thing, Bunter, he murmured. All that preaching about the word. And in the end, it's silence that saves us. And as they walked away, the faint wind through the cathedral arches sounded almost like a sigh, soft, penitent, and strangely final. The following morning dawned with a thin veil of mist that clung to Dorchester's rooftops and turned every cobblestone into a glimmering uncertainty. Whimsy, seated at a small table in the dining room of the King's Head, stirred his coffee absently, watching the cream curl into indecisive clouds. Across from him, Bunter perused the Times with the delicate gravity of a man appraising a relic. "Coroner's inquiry to be convened on Friday," Bunter reported, folding the paper with ecclesiastical precision. "They're calling it self-inflicted shock and heart failure, my lord. No mention of any theological context." Whimsy gave a faint snort. "Naturally. One doesn't put theology on a death certificate. It's too vague a poison." He sipped the coffee and winced slightly. "This hotel, Bunter, manages to make coffee that tastes both burnt and underdone. A rare skill, worthy of the Archdeacon's moral philosophy." Bunter allowed himself a thin smile. "Shall we be returning to London, my lord?" Whimsy drummed his fingers thoughtfully. "Soon, but not quite yet. There's a small detail still fluttering about, like a moth that refuses to die in the candle flame." He leaned back, half closing his eyes. "Claymore's sermon notes. Frobisher said he burned them, yet they were never found in the grate. And Miss Lacy's voice, her supposed hearing of Claymore's words after death, might have been no hallucination. Suppose someone had access to a phonograph cylinder before Frobisher's own confession. Suppose it wasn't his voice she heard at first, but Claymore's, used against him." Bunter frowned slightly. "Then someone played Claymore's own sermon to him to drive him mad." "Not quite. More ingenious than that. Someone reversed his own rhetoric against him, perhaps using one of those new cylinder recorders, cutting and rearranging sentences until the words themselves condemned him. Imagine the shock of hearing one's own sermon pronouncing judgment in one's own voice, out of context and yet terribly apt. For a man of faith, it would feel like divine accusation." He rose abruptly, chair scraping against the worn floorboards. "Fetch your hat, Bunter. We're calling on Miss Lacy." The vicarage garden was soaked in dew, every leaf trembling with the freshness of dawn. Miss Lacy opened the door herself, her expression composed but wary, as though she had spent the night in quiet battle with her conscience. "Lord Peter, you've heard?" she asked. Whimsy inclined his head. "Yes, the Archdeacon has, as they say, joined the choir invisible. I come not as inquisitor, Miss Lacy, but as humble inquirer. You see, I cannot quite believe the Archdeacon acted alone." Her fingers tightened on the doorframe. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Whimsy said lightly, "that his guilt was too symmetrical, too literary. Men rarely achieve that kind of neatness in their moral collapses. But women, when moved by love or revenge, are capable of such exquisite symmetry." She went very still. The morning light touched her hair, catching in the pale gold strands like threads of fire. "You think I think," he interrupted softly, "that you were fond of Reverend Claymore, that you resented the Archdeacon's influence over him, that when Claymore's doubts began to trouble him, you found in his recorded sermons a weapon of sorts, a means to turn his own sanctimony against him. Perhaps it was intended merely to frighten him, but fear, like faith, tends to overperform." Her voice trembled. "I didn't mean. Lord Peter, I swear I only wanted him to see what he'd become." The Archdeacon filled his head with judgment and damnation until he scarcely knew where his own thoughts ended. "I thought if he heard himself as others did, if he could only hear it." She broke off, covering her mouth with her hand. Whimsy's gaze softened, but his voice remained steady. "And when he died, you feared discovery. So you brought the cylinder to Frobisher, hoping his piety would shield you. But Frobisher, Poor, ambitious Frobisher saw in it an opportunity to wield divine terror himself. The rest followed inevitably. Miss Lacey sank into a chair, face pale. "I destroyed my cylinder," she whispered. "But he must have made a copy. I didn't. No, until he came to me last week, speaking in that dreadful, solemn tone, telling me the voice of God still spoke." Whimsy regarded her gravely. So the voice moved from Claymore to Frobisher, and from Frobisher to silence. A proper apostolic succession, if one may say so. He sighed and glanced toward the garden. "You won't be prosecuted, Miss Lacey. The law cannot indict remorse, but I should advise you never to touch another phonograph." When they left the vicarage, the bells of St. Agatha's were tolling for morning prayer. Whimsy paused at the gate, listening. "You know, Bunter," he murmured, "there's a curious justice in it, a tale of voices, all of them human, all pretending to be divine, and in the end, every one of them silenced." Bunter nodded. "And your sermon, my lord?" Whimsy smiled faintly. "Oh, I shan't deliver it. Too few would stay awake for the moral, that even when men think they're listening to God, they're usually just hearing an echo of themselves." He turned up his collar and began the slow walk toward the station, his footsteps blending with the distant tolling that faded one by one into the quiet of the morning mist. They were halfway to the station before Whimsy slowed his stride, gaze wandering from the damp hedgerows to the silver wash of the sky, where the first break of sunlight slipped through the mist like a reluctant confession. He stopped altogether and drew his gloves tight, as though something unseen had caught at the edge of his thought. "Bunter," he said quietly, "do you know what I dislike most about logical conclusions?" Bunter considered. "They're rarely final, my lord." "Precisely." Whimsy smiled thinly. "A good conclusion should feel like death, a full stop. This one feels more like a semicolon, which, if you've read much theology, you'll know is the punctuation of hesitation." He turned back toward the village. "Come along. We'll miss the train, but I fancy one last look at St. Agatha's before we depart. Something in the Archdeacon's final words refuses to stay decently buried." The church stood in the same heavy silence as before, the mist gathering now around its base like smoke from an extinguished censer. The door gave way with the weary sigh of old hinges, and Whimsy stepped inside, hat in hand. The faint smell of candle wax and damp stone lingered, the morning light slicing the nave into pale, reluctant ribbons. He made his way up the aisle to the pulpit, his footsteps echoing in that hollow, weighty air. Bunter followed at a respectful distance, though his eyes, ever observant, caught the faintest glint at the base of the pulpit. Something metallic. "My lord," he murmured, stooping. "A key." Whimsy took it from him, holding it up to the light. It was small and brass, the sort used for vestry cabinets, yet oddly polished, as if recently handled. He looked toward the vestry door, slightly ajar, the darkness, beyond, suggestive. "Ah," Whimsy breathed, "our semicolon." Inside, the vestry was orderly to the point of severity, robes neatly hung, communion vessels stacked with monastic precision. But on the table lay a parcel, brown paper tied with thin black ribbon, addressed in a looping, ornate hand, "To whoever remains when I do not." Whimsy untied it gently. Within lay a slim, leather-bound book, a diary. The name embossed within the cover read, "Reverend Samuel Claymore." "Bunter, I begin to suspect Providence has taken up amateur detection." The entries began innocuously. Parish accounts, visits to the sick, sermons drafted and redrafted. But as Whimsy skimmed through, the tone darkened. Phrases emerged in quick succession. "The Archdeacon presses me to preach fire again," and later, "He says the flock needs fear, not comfort." Then, further on, "I no longer know whose voice speaks when I stand in the pulpit." Whimsy's brow furrowed. The final entry bore the date 2 days before Claymore's death. He has sent me my own words, cut and spliced, returning to me like the echo of damnation. I do not remember recording half of them, yet they sound as I have spoken. God help me if it is not the devil, then it must be man. And which is worse, I cannot tell. Whimsy closed the diary and exhaled softly. So, the sermon that frightened him to death was indeed his own, reconstructed artfully enough to sound infernal. But not by Miss Lacey, nor by the Archdeacon. Someone else meddled with the machine. Bunter looked up sharply. Then who, my lord? The devil, in the Anglican sense, meaning a zealous assistant with too much free time. Whimsy's gaze drifted toward the small back staircase leading up to the organ loft. The curate, Bunter, young Mr. Hadley. He arranged the recordings, did he not? The good Archdeacon would not deign to handle machinery. He ascended slowly, the wooden steps creaking in rhythm with his thoughts. At the top, the organ loomed like some enormous fossil, its pipes gleaming dully in the pale light. On the small table beside it sat the phonograph apparatus, one cylinder still mounted, half wound. Whimsy adjusted the needle and turned the crank. The machine crackled into life, and a voice emerged. Claymore's again, trembling, despairing. I am judged already. The word has spoken, and it condemns me. Then another voice, faint but unmistakable. Hadley's, soft, coaxing, almost priestly in its calm. Listen, Reverend. Listen to what the Spirit reveals. Do you hear him? Bunter's eyes widened. Whimsy stopped the cylinder with a flick of his wrist. Manipulation masquerading as revelation. Hadley recorded, edited, and replayed Claymore's own words until the man broke beneath them. Then, when the Archdeacon discovered the trick, he turned it to his own ends and met the same ruin, a neat pattern of contagion. He stood in silence for a moment, gazing down over the empty pews. Religious terror, he murmured, is frightfully efficient when properly engineered. Bunter's voice was low. And what of Hadley now, my lord? Gone, I expect. Vanished into whatever corner Providence reserves for the overzealous. But he'll turn up. These men always do. Somewhere preaching redemption in borrowed words. As they descended the stairs, the mist outside had begun to lift. The bells stirred faintly in the tower, a note or two drifting through the air like hesitant repentance. Whimsy paused at the threshold, looking back once more at the pulpit. 3 men destroyed by the same sermon, Bunter. One who wrote it, one who replayed it, and one who believed it. The devil, if he exists, is surely an editor. He smiled faintly, almost sadly. Come, let's catch the next train. I've a sudden craving for silence, and London, for all its noise, is remarkably good at providing it. The train to London rattled through the gathering dusk, its wheels ticking out a rhythm like the slow punctuation of a sermon finally nearing its close. Whimsy sat alone in the compartment this time, hat tilted forward, eyes half shuttered. Bunter had gone in search of tea, leaving his master to that particular species of silence which follows revelation, a silence that is not rest, but the weary settling of truth into place. On the seat beside him lay Claymore's diary and the phonograph cylinder, both sealed now in brown paper, their significance diminished to the dull weight of evidence. Whimsy's long fingers tapped idly on the cover. The countryside outside unrolled like an afterthought. Grey fields, darker hedgerows, occasional glimpses of lonely church spires pricking the horizon. When Bunter returned, balancing 2 cups and the faint scent of railway coffee, he found Whimsy staring into nothing with a peculiar expression, somewhere between amusement and fatigue. I was thinking, Whimsy murmured, accepting the cup, how dreadfully easy it is to mistake the echo of one's own convictions for the voice of heaven. Poor Claymore heard judgment in his own cadence. Frobisher mistook guilt for grace. And Hadley, he fancied himself a conductor of divine acoustics. Bunter sat silent. The method, you see, was diabolical only in its simplicity. Claymore's old sermons were recorded by the choir boys for posterity. Hadley merely spliced them, rearranged a phrase here, a pause there. A scrap of borrowed fire and brimstone turned back upon its maker. He tested it first on the rector, and when that proved fatal, on the archdeacon for his own grim amusement or ambition. He wanted proof that the word could still kill. He leaned back, the ghost of a smile flickering. In the end, of course, it did, but not in the way he intended. Words never destroy only their object. They corrode their speaker as well. That's the real theology of the thing. The train jolted as it entered a tunnel. For a moment, the compartment went, utterly black save for the faint ember of Whimsy's cigarette. When light returned, he sighed and drew from his pocket a single folded telegram. Hadley was found in Winchester, he said softly. In a boarding house. Dead. Gas tap left open. On the floor beside him, another phonograph cylinder. It was empty. He let the words settle, faintly echoing the cylinder's silence. So the sermon comes full circle, Bunter. The machine that gave him the voice of God left him none of his own. Rather poetic, don't you think? Tragic, my lord. Same thing, in the hands of Providence. Whimsy smiled faintly and flicked his ash out the window. He created his own revelation, and when the echo failed to answer, he could not endure the quiet. That's faith inverted, Bunter. Belief turned upon itself like a serpent devouring its tail. The train slowed, London lights glimmering ahead like a constellation rearranged by human vanity. Whimsy rose, stretching, his movements unhurried. Well, that's the end of the liturgy, he said lightly. 3 deaths, 1 confession, and a tidy morale about the perils of too much zeal. If the clergy were wiser, they'd preach shorter sermons. He gathered his things, and as they stepped down onto the platform, the noise of the city rose around them. Omnibuses, vendors, the rhythm of footsteps on stone. A familiar chaos, alive and indifferent. At the exit, Bunter hesitated. "Will you write to Miss Lacey, my lord?" Whimsy paused, gloved hand on his cane. "Perhaps. She deserves to know the voice is finally silenced. But what would I say, that her small deceit bloomed into a triad of deaths? No, best to let her believe the evil was purged with the archdeacon's soul. A little mercy costs nothing, and the truth, I find, is often less charitable than fiction." He turned toward the cab rank, the flicker of a lamplight catching on the silver rim of his monocle. "Come along, Bunter. Let's leave the clergy to their echoes. I've a mind for oysters, a glass of Chablis, and a very long silence." As the cab rattled off into the London fog, Whimsy glanced once through the window, watching the dim spires fade into the murk. Somewhere behind them, the church bells of Dorset were beginning their evening toll. For an instant, they seemed to merge with the city's clamour, the echo of one world dissolving into another, voices fading into silence, silence folding back into sound. "Curious thing," he murmured, half to himself, "how even God's voice needs an audience." And with that faint, ironic benediction, Lord Peter Whimsy settled back in his seat, eyes closing as London swallowed the last trace of the sermon that had feared itself.